All right, let's dive into this book you sent over, The Marriage Trap by Conrad Riker. It seems like it's going to be a juicy one.
It definitely seems to be making some waves.
Yeah, from what I've skimmed so far, Riker doesn't really hold back on his opinions about the challenges men face in marriage and family law. In fact, right off the bat, he says this book isn't for people who haven't gone through these things themselves, or for people who just don't think men's rights are worth fighting for.
Yeah, he sets a pretty strong tone from the get-go.
He does.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to get your take on all this, experts. What are your initial thoughts about Riker's central arguments?
Well, one thing that struck me was how he draws this parallel between historical coverture laws,
Mm.
where women had very limited rights, and what he calls the new coverture.
The new covered.
Yeah, basically arguing that modern marriage and family law have kind of flipped the script, and now it's men who are getting the short end of the stick.
Okay, so help me unpack this new coverture idea. What exactly does he mean by that?
He's essentially saying that things like divorce laws, alimony, child support, they're all structured in a way that puts men at a disadvantage. Like he says, men are often painted as the bad guys in divorces, and they and end up shouldering these huge financial burdens.
So it's like he's saying the system is rigged against them from the start.
That's the impression you get. Yeah.
Hmm.
He uses this phrase, glorified ATMs,
Yeah.
to describe how a lot of men feel after going through a divorce.
I can see how facing those kind of financial obligations could feel incredibly burdensome. But isn't the idea behind things like alimony and child support to make sure that both spouses and, most importantly, the kids are taken care of? Especially if one spouse maybe hasn't been working as much during the marriage.
Yeah, that's definitely the intention. And to be fair, the book isn't saying we should just get rid of alimony or child support altogether. It's more about raising questions about whether the current system is actually fair
Right.
and if it's always achieving what it's supposed to.
Right. It's about starting a conversation about potential problems and looking for solutions.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the new coverture. Now, another thing that really stood out to me was how Riker talks about false accusations against men. There's just one story in the book about a guy named John who was falsely accused of sexual assault by his wife and ended up getting arrested, and his reputation was just completely tarnished. It's a pretty disturbing thought that something like that could happen to someone.
It is a scary thought. The book uses this anecdote, and a few others, to argue that men are just inherently more vulnerable to false accusations, especially during things like divorce or custody battles.
It seems like Riker is suggesting that these accusations are used as a tactic to gain an advantage.
That's how he frames it. And he even throws out this statistic that 89% of people wrongfully convicted of sexual assault are men, and that black men make up 65% of that group.
Whoa, those are some pretty shocking numbers if they're accurate. Do you think those statistics paint the whole picture, though? Or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think it's important to dig a little deeper into those numbers. While it's likely those figures are based on data from the National Registry of Exonerations, we have to keep in mind that that data set is specifically focused on cases where people were officially proven innocent.
So it's not necessarily representative of every single case of a false accusation?
Right. It doesn't capture all the situations where maybe someone was accused but not officially exonerated. And it doesn't tell us anything about the reasons behind those accusations.
Yeah, that's a really good point to remember. I think we tend to focus on the extreme cases, where the system clearly fails, but there's a whole spectrum of experiences out there.
There is. And the book's focus on these extreme cases can create this narrative of men being inherently at risk,
Mm.
which might lead to some men feeling fearful or distrustful even when it's not necessarily warranted.
Right. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the potential risks
Right.
without letting fear completely dictate your actions and your outlook. So we've got this idea of the new coverture and the fear of false accusations. And Riker seems to connect these fears to a growing trend of men choosing to opt out of marriage and traditional relationships altogether. He talks about this men going their own way movement, or MGTOW.
Yeah, he definitely sees MGTOW as a direct response to these injustices that he's laying out. But it's important to remember that MGTOW is a pretty complex phenomenon with a wide range of viewpoints and motivations.
So you're saying it's more than just a reaction against marriage and relationships?
Yeah, reducing it to just that oversimplifies it. I think there are a lot of broader social and cultural factors at play, too.
Like what kind of things are you thinking of?
Well, things like the changing roles of men and women in society, economic shifts, even the impact of technology on how we connect with each other.
It's like all these different forces are converging.
Right, and it's creating this complex landscape that's hard to fully understand.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of the new coverture, the fear of false accusations, and this rising MGTOW movement. Now, another big area Riker dives into is the role of family courts. He argues that fathers are routinely disadvantaged when it comes to custody arrangements. He even cites a statistic that fathers are granted sole custody in less than 20% of cases.
Yeah, he paints a pretty bleak picture of how family courts treat fathers.
And then he shares a story about this guy named James, who is a stay-at-home dad, super involved in his kids' lives, but then after his divorce, he was denied custody.
That's a tough one to hear because it raises the question, are family courts just inherently biased against men? Riker certainly thinks so. But I think it's important to acknowledge that custody decisions are really complicated. Judges have to consider a lot of different factors.
Like what kind of factor?
Well, of course, the child's best interests are paramount. They also look at each parent's ability to provide a stable and loving environment, and even the child's own preferences, if they're old enough to express them.
So it's not as simple as just assuming that the courts always favor mothers.
Right? Well, the book definitely pushes that narrative. I think it's important to recognize that these decisions aren't always black and white.
It's about looking at each case individually and considering all the nuances.
Exactly.
That being said, Riker does seem to be advocating for more shared parenting arrangements. He argues that the current system often defaults to a maternal preference, which might not always be what's best for the child.
And that's an interesting point because there is growing research that supports the benefits of shared parenting, especially when both parents are capable of providing a safe and nurturing environment.
So it seems like there's some common ground there, even if Riker's approach might be a bit too one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I think he tends to lean towards these broad solutions,
Mm-hmm.
when in reality, every family situation is unique.
Right. There's no magic formula that's going to work for everyone. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. We've got the new coverture, the fear of false accusations, the rise of MGTOW, and this whole debate about family courts and custody arrangements. And it seems like all these issues are interconnected in a really complex way.
They definitely are.
It's like this tangled web that's hard to unravel.
It is, and I think that's part of what makes Riker's book so thought-provoking, even if you don't agree with everything he says.
Yeah, he's definitely forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths and to think critically about how these issues are impacting men's lives.
He is, and that's a valuable conversation to be having, even if it's a difficult one.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure our listeners are already processing a lot of information.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
We'll pick up this conversation in the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some more of Riker's arguments, including his views on the financial burdens placed on men, and this idea of a red pill moment of awakening.
It should be an interesting discussion.
It definitely will be. So until then, keep those gears turning, and we'll see you back here soon.
Looking forward to it. Picking up where we left off, the marriage trap goes on to really dig into the financial burdens men face, especially when it comes to things like divorce and child support. Riker doesn't sugarcoat it either. He uses some strong language, almost calling it a form of financial enslavement that can really cripple men economically. He talks about men being driven to bankruptcy, facing serious hardship just from trying to meet these obligations.
That sounds incredibly stressful, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the purpose of these payments? Are they always punitive, like Riker suggests, or are there situations where they genuinely serve a necessary function?
Well, with child support, the intention is to ensure the financial well-being of the children. It's not about punishing the father. It's about making sure the kids have the resources they need. As for alimony, that's more about supporting a spouse who maybe sacrificed career opportunities or earning potential during the marriage.
So it's more about trying to create some level of financial balance after the marriage ends, recognizing that one spouse might be at a disadvantage.
Right. And while Riker really frames these payments as inherently unfair to men, it's important to keep in mind that the courts are ultimately aiming for fairness for both parties. Relationships and contributions to a marriage aren't always just about money.
That makes sense. It's not about punishing one person,
Yeah.
but about trying to create a more equitable situation. So Riker dives into the financial burdens, and he also talks about men needing to develop resilience and coping mechanisms to navigate a world that he sees as increasingly hostile towards them.
He does. He really stresses the importance of self-care for men, focusing on their physical, mental, and emotional well-being, which is interesting because self-care is often talked about more in relation to women's experiences.
So maybe he's trying to reclaim that concept for men, recognizing they also face unique pressures
Yeah.
and need healthy ways to deal with them.
Yeah, perhaps.
He also emphasizes the importance of community for men, finding mentors, building support networks, even using humor as a way to connect and cope.
That focus on community and connection seems crucial, especially because men are often stereotyped as being more isolated or reluctant to express their emotions.
It is. And this idea of men supporting each other really ties into his red pill concept, which he describes as this moment of awakening when a man recognizes what he sees as the truth about societal manipulation and the oppression of men.
So it's like he's saying men need to wake up to these injustices and then band together to fight back.
That's one interpretation. He argues that once you take the red pill, you can't go back to seeing the world the same way. He sees those traditional roles and relationships that society promotes as a kind of trap, a lie that ultimately hurts men.
Wow. It's a pretty strong image. He's not holding back on his critique of the status quo. No, he's not. He uses some pretty bold language, comparing men to second-class citizens and suggesting that they're systematically disadvantaged by everything from laws and social norms to even the language we use to talk about gender.
It's a pretty bleak picture, and I think it's important to remember that this is just one perspective. While some men might resonate with this idea of being oppressed or marginalized, others might have totally different experiences.
Exactly. It's not a universal experience. And it's important to avoid painting with too broad a brush.
So how does he tie this red pill idea to the MGTOW movement?
He sees MGTOW as a natural response to the injustices he describes. But again, it's crucial to recognize that the MGTOW movement is pretty complex. The marriage trap only offers one perspective on it.
So it's important to avoid generalizations about the movement as a whole.
Absolutely. While the book frames MGTOW as a form of self-preservation for men, there are definitely a range of interpretations out there, some more extreme than others.
So it's about recognizing that nuance and not assuming everyone in that movement fits neatly into one box. Okay, so we've got the red pill and MGTOW. Now, another interesting term Riker uses is feminized workplace. He uses this term to describe what he sees as a trend, where traditional male roles and values are being eroded, often at the expense of men.
Right. It's like he's suggesting that any shift towards a more inclusive or diverse workplace is inherently a bad thing for men.
It sounds like he's saying that as more women enter the workforce and take on leadership roles, men are being pushed out or forced to conform to a different set of expectations.
He definitely seems to be arguing that traditional masculine traits and behaviors are being devalued. And he even uses the concept of toxic masculinity as an example. He sees it as a weaponized term that's used to silence men and prevent them from expressing themselves authentically.
It's like he's saying men are walking on eggshells, afraid to be themselves for fear of being labeled as toxic.
That's how he frames it. He provides examples of men who have faced disciplinary action, or even been fired for behavior that he argues would have been overlooked in the past.
It's a sensitive topic for sure, but I think it's important to remember that workplace dynamics are always evolving. While it's definitely possible for men to experience bias or unfair treatment, it's crucial to avoid making sweeping generalizations.
Absolutely. Not every workplace is hostile towards men, and not every disciplinary action is a result of gender bias.
Right. It's about looking at each situation individually and avoiding those blanket judgments about entire organizations or industries.
Exactly.
And it's also important to remember that creating a more inclusive and respectful workplace is generally a good thing. It's not about punishing men, but about creating an environment where everyone feels safe and valued.
I agree.
So Riker criticizes the feminized workplace, and he also takes aim at the gender pay gap, arguing that it's a myth that's perpetuated to promote a narrative of female victimhood.
He claims that when you account for things like education experience and hours worked, the pay gap disappears.
So he's saying it's not actually about gender discrimination, but about differences in choices that men and women make.
That's his argument. But again, it's a really complex issue.
Right. It's not as simple as saying it's either entirely real or entirely a myth.
Exactly. Research suggests that gender bias still plays a role.
So there's no easy answer. Okay, so we've got the feminized workplace, the gender pay gap debate, and now Riker delves into what he calls the minefield of modern dating.
Yes, he seems to be arguing that the rules of dating have changed dramatically, leaving a lot of men feeling lost and confused.
It sounds like he's saying men are at a disadvantage in the modern dating world.
He definitely paints that picture. He talks about unrealistic expectations, the fear of false accusations, and the potential for serious consequences.
It's like he's saying men need a roadmap just to navigate this new terrain.
He even claims that some women use the legal system or social norms to their advantage,
Yeah.
potentially making false accusations or leveraging their perceived victimhood.
To gain power in relationships.
Exactly. He shares examples of men who've been falsely accused of things like harassment or abuse,
Oh.
or who've been financially exploited.
But are those examples representative of a broader trend? Or are they more like isolated incidents?
That's a good question. While it's important to acknowledge that men can absolutely be victims of abuse or manipulation, I think it's crucial to avoid painting all women with the same brush.
Right. It shouldn't be about assuming one gender is always the victim or the perpetrator.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that relationships are complex and that both men and women can behave badly.
So Riker talks about the challenges of modern dating in general, and he also specifically mentions the impact of online dating,
Yeah, he argues that it's created a more superficial and transactional approach to relationships.
leading to a sense of detachment and objectification.
He seems to think so. He talks about how it can lead to disappointment and a lack of genuine connection.
It's interesting because online dating has obviously changed the dating landscape in a lot of
It
ways.
has both positive and negative.
So it's about recognizing the potential pitfalls and using online dating as a tool while still maintaining realistic expectations.
Right. It's about being intentional in your approach to dating, both online and offline.
And focusing on building meaningful connections based on shared values.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got the challenges of modern dating. And now Riker takes it a step further. He talks about what he calls a gynocentric society.
Ah, yes. This is where he really broadens his critique.
So what exactly does he mean by gynocentric society, and what are the implications he sees for men?
He's essentially arguing that we live in a culture where female values and perspectives are dominant, often at the expense of men.
So it's like he's saying the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction.
That's how he sees it. He points to things like the prevalence of what he calls male bashing in
Yeah.
popular culture, the increasing focus on women's issues in academia and the media, and the perceived bias against men in family courts, which we talked about earlier.
So he's connecting all these different dots to paint a picture of a society that he sees as increasingly hostile towards men.
Exactly. But I think it's important to remember that societal trends are incredibly complex.
So while women have made significant progress in areas like education and employment, it's debatable whether we've actually reached a point of a true gynocentric society.
I agree. It's not about pitting men against women or creating a zero-sum game. It's about recognizing that these are complex issues.
And finding ways to create a more equitable and inclusive society for everyone.
Exactly.
So Riker argues that this shift towards a gynocentric society has led to a crisis of masculinity. He talks about men feeling emasculated, alienated, and unsure of their place in the world.
He definitely makes that connection.
Yeah.
He links it to declining marriage rates,
Yeah.
a rise in fatherlessness, and a general sense of malaise among men.
It's a pretty bleak assessment, but is it really accurate to say that all men are experiencing this crisis of masculinity?
I don't think so. There are plenty of men who are thriving in our current society and who feel comfortable embracing both their masculine and feminine qualities.
So it's important to avoid those sweeping generalizations.
It is, just like not all women experience the world in the same way.
Not all men are struggling with their identity in the same way.
Exactly.
So if Riker believes we're living in this gynocentric society, what does he propose men do about it? Does he offer any solutions?
He does. He encourages men to embrace traditional masculine virtues, things like strength, stoicism, and self-reliance.
So it's about reclaiming those aspects of masculinity
Yeah.
that he feels have been lost or devalued.
That's how he frames it. He also advocates for men to be more active in their communities, to mentor younger men, and to challenge the dominant cultural narrative.
It sounds like he's calling for a masculine rebirth.
He uses that exact term. But I think it's important to approach this idea with caution.
How so?
While there's nothing wrong with encouraging men to be strong and resilient, we have to be careful about promoting outdated stereotypes.
Or suggesting that men need to reclaim their dominance in society.
Right. It's about finding a healthy balance, encouraging positive aspects of masculinity while also promoting respect and equality between men and women.
So it's not about turning back the clock, but about integrating traditional values into a modern world.
Exactly. It's about evolution, not revolution.
And about recognizing that true strength lies in adaptability and the ability to embrace change rather than resisting it.
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time unpacking Riker's arguments in The Marriage Trap, and I have to admit, it's a pretty intense read. He paints a pretty bleak picture of what he sees as the state of modern manhood. But I'm curious, is it all doom and gloom?
Well, it's important to remember that this is just one perspective,
Hmm.
and it's a perspective that definitely leans towards the negative.
So you're saying there's another side to this story?
I think so. I think there are also a lot of positive developments happening that Riker's book doesn't really address.
Like what kind of things are you thinking of?
So for one thing, there's a growing recognition of the vital role that fathers play in their children's lives.
So maybe we're starting to move away from that traditional maternal preference that Riker criticizes so much.
Possibly. We're seeing more of a push for shared parenting arrangements, which could benefit both men and children.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other areas where you see things heading in a more balanced direction?
I think so. There's also increasing awareness of men's mental health issues.
That's a big one. It seems like for a long time, men were almost expected to just suck it up and deal with their problems on their own.
Right. There was this stigma around men expressing their emotions or seeking help.
But it seems like that's starting to change,
It is. We're seeing more resources and support systems becoming available specifically for men.
which is really encouraging. I think recognizing that men need support and connection
Mm,
is a huge step in the right direction.
I agree. And we're also seeing a shift in those traditional gender roles.
You mean with more men taking on caregiving responsibilities and more women pursuing careers?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
not about adhering to these rigid roles anymore.
It's about finding arrangements that work for individual families.
Right. And technology is playing a role too.
How so?
Online communities and support networks are giving men spaces to connect with others who are going through similar things.
So it's like they're finding a sense of brotherhood online
Mm.
that maybe they're not finding in their everyday lives.
Possibly. I think these online communities can provide a sense of validation and support.
That can be so crucial,
Uh,
especially when you're feeling isolated or like you don't have anyone to talk to.
you can.
Okay, so it sounds like the conversation around men's rights and the challenges they face is becoming more nuanced and less one-sided.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's not just about pointing fingers or blaming one gender or the other.
It's about acknowledging the complexities and working towards solutions together.
Exactly.
So if we were to zoom out and look at the big picture, what do you think the future holds for men, especially in light of all the issues that Riker raises in The Marriage Trap?
Well, I think the future holds a lot of potential for men to embrace their masculinity in healthy and positive ways.
Yeah.
It's not about rejecting those traditional values.
But about finding ways to integrate them into a world that values equality and respect between genders.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between strength and sensitivity,
Mhm.
assertiveness and compassion,
Hmm.
providing and caregiving.
It's about recognizing that men can be multifaceted individuals with a wide range of skills and interests and aspirations.
Right. And it's about creating a society that supports and encourages that diversity of expression.
That's a great way to put it. It's not about limiting men to a narrow definition of masculinity, but about expanding the possibilities for what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm feeling a little more optimistic after that. It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, but it's important to remember that there's always hope.
There is. And it's up to all of us to keep working towards a better future.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into The Marriage Trap. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and engaging with these important issues. Remember, this is just the start of the conversation. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more equitable and just world for everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep.